The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Millbrook's village square like a shroud, and 12-year-old Eliza Hartwell shivered in her threadbare dress as she stood upon the wooden platform. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the gathered crowd, his words cutting through her heart like shards of ice. She had always known this day would come, ever since the workhouse master had declared her old enough to earn her keep elsewhere, but knowing hadn't made it any easier to bear. "Here we have a fine young lass, strong of back and quick of mind," the auctioneer announced, gesturing toward Eliza with his gnarled walking stick. "Raised proper at St. Agatha's workhouse, she can read, write, and cipher better than most. Perfect for kitchen work, mending, or tending to the little ones in any fine household." Eliza kept her chin raised, despite the tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. Her mother had always told her to stand tall, no matter what storms life might bring. Though Margaret Hartwell had been taken by fever when Eliza was merely 8, her words remained a beacon of strength. "Remember, my darling girl," her mother had whispered in those final days, "you carry within you the blood of kings and the heart of a lion. No circumstance can diminish your worth." The crowd below seemed a sea of calculating faces, each potential buyer examining her as if she were livestock at market. Mrs. Pemberton, the baker's wife, whispered something to her husband about needing help with the ovens. Mr. Thornfield, who owned the largest farm in 3 counties, stroked his beard thoughtfully while his wife counted coins in her purse. Even old Miss Weatherby, known throughout the village for her harsh treatment of servants, had come to survey the offerings. "What am I bid for this industrious young woman?" the auctioneer called out, his voice carrying over the murmur of the crowd. "She comes with excellent references from the workhouse, never a troublemaker, always eager to please." The first bid came from Mrs. Pemberton. £5 for 3 years' service. £6, counted Mr. Thornfield immediately. "7," called out a voice from the back, though Eliza couldn't see who had spoken. As the numbers climbed, Eliza's heart sank deeper. Each bid represented years of her life, years she would spend in service to strangers who saw her as nothing more than a pair of working hands. She had dreamed, in her quiet moments at the workhouse, of perhaps finding a kind family who might treat her with some measure of affection. But looking at the faces below, she saw only cold calculation and economic necessity. £10 for 5 years' service. Miss Weatherby's sharp voice cut through the morning air, causing several people to turn and stare. It was an unusually generous bid from the notoriously tight-fisted woman, though Eliza knew it likely meant harder work and crueler treatment. The auctioneer's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. £10. Do I hear 11? The square fell silent for a moment, and Eliza's fate seemed sealed. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine herself scrubbing floors in Miss Weatherby's dark house, enduring sharp words and meagre meals, counting down the days until her 5 years of bondage were complete. But then, like thunder rolling across a summer sky, came the sound of horse hooves on cobblestone. The crowd turned as one toward the approaching rider, and gasps rippled through the assembled villagers. Even the auctioneer fell silent, his mouth hanging open in astonishment. A magnificent black stallion emerged from the morning mist, bearing a rider whose very presence seemed to command the attention of every soul in the square. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in the finest riding clothes Eliza had ever seen. His dark hair was perfectly styled despite his ride, and his face, though bearing the austere handsomeness of nobility, carried an expression of barely contained fury. "That," whispered someone in the crowd, "is His Grace, the Duke of Raven's Hollow." Eliza had heard whispers of the Duke throughout her years at the workhouse, stories told by servants who had worked in great houses, tales of a man who had inherited his title young and lived in solitude at his vast estate. They said he was learned and wealthy beyond measure, but also mysterious and perhaps touched by some great sadness. No one could remember the last time he had been seen in the village. Certainly not at something so common as a workhouse auction. The Duke dismounted with fluid grace, his boots striking the cobblestones with authority. When he spoke, his voice carried the refined accent of the highest nobility, but underneath it ran a current of steel that made every person in the square take notice. "What manner of barbarism is this?" he demanded, his piercing grey eyes sweeping over the assembled crowd before settling on the auctioneer. "In what civilized society are children sold like cattle in the public square?" The auctioneer stammered, clearly unprepared for such an interruption from someone of such elevated station. "Your Grace, This is perfectly legal, sanctioned by the parish and the workhouse board. The girl needs placement and—" "The girl," the Duke said, his voice cutting through the man's excuses like a sword through silk, "has a name, and she deserves far better than to be bartered over by strangers." For the first time since stepping onto that platform, Eliza felt something other than despair. This stranger, this powerful man who could have simply ridden past without a second glance, had stopped for her. She watched in amazement as he strode toward the platform, his presence causing the crowd to part before him like the Red Sea before Moses. The Duke's eyes met hers, and in that moment Eliza saw something she had never expected to find in the gaze of a nobleman: kindness. Not pity, not calculation, but genuine human kindness mixed with what looked almost like recognition, as if he saw something in her that others had missed. "What is your name, child?" he asked gently, his earlier anger giving way to something warmer. "Eliza Hartwell." "Your Grace," she replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. He nodded slowly, as if her name held some significance she couldn't understand. Then he turned back to the auctioneer with renewed determination. "I'll take her," he announced, his words sending a shockwave through the crowd. "Name your price." The square erupted in whispers and gasps. Miss Weatherby's face turned an alarming shade of purple, while Mrs. Pemberton clutched her husband's arm in shock. Never in living memory had a duke involved himself in workhouse business, let alone offered to take in an orphan girl. The auctioneer's hands trembled as he fumbled with his papers. "Your Grace, surely you don't mean— that is to say, a gentleman of your station wouldn't normally— I mean no offence, but perhaps you haven't fully considered—" "I have considered quite thoroughly," the Duke replied with icy precision. "The girl requires a home, does she not? I have a home that requires companionship. It seems a perfectly reasonable arrangement." "But, Your Grace," Mr. Thornfield ventured, stepping forward with his hat in his hands, "begging your pardon, but what would a young lass do at Raven's Hollow Manor? It's been years since you've had proper staff, and the place is said to be—" He trailed off, clearly thinking better of speaking too plainly about the Duke's affairs, but everyone knew what he meant. Raven's Hollow Manor had been closed to visitors for nearly a decade, ever since the tragic accident that had claimed the Duke's young fiancée. The few servants who remained were tight-lipped about their master's life, but rumours persisted of a man consumed by grief and scholarship, living like a hermit in his vast estate. The Duke's expression darkened at the unfinished comment, but his voice remained controlled. "Miss Hartwell will be treated as befits a young lady of quality. She will receive proper education, clothing, and care. I trust that addresses any concerns about her welfare?" Eliza's heart hammered in her chest. This couldn't be real. Dukes didn't rescue orphan girls from auctions, especially not dukes known for their reclusiveness. Yet here he stood, negotiating for her freedom with the same intensity another man might use to purchase a thoroughbred horse. "The current bid stands at £10, the auctioneer managed to say, though his voice cracked slightly. "If your Grace wishes to—" £50, the Duke said without hesitation, causing several people in the crowd to gasp audibly. "And I'll pay it now in gold." The sum was outrageous, more than many families in the village earned in 2 years. Miss Weatherby made a strangled sound of protest, but no one dared challenge a duke's offer, especially not one made so publicly and with such clear intent. As the Duke counted out gleaming coins from his purse, Eliza tried to make sense of what was happening. Why would this powerful stranger pay such an enormous sum for her? What did he mean by companionship? And why did he look at her with such intense curiosity, as if trying to solve some complicated puzzle? "There is one condition," the Duke said suddenly, turning back to face the crowd. His voice carried easily across the square, ensuring everyone could hear. "Miss Hartwell comes to my household not as a servant, but as my ward. She will be educated as a lady and treated with all the respect due to one under my protection. Anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me personally." The crowd fell silent at the barely veiled threat in his words. Even Miss Weatherby seemed to shrink back slightly, and Eliza noticed several people suddenly finding their boots very interesting. The transaction completed with remarkable speed after that. Papers were signed, coins exchanged, and within minutes, Eliza found herself walking across the cobblestones toward the Duke's magnificent horse. She could hardly believe this was real. Surely, she would wake up back in her narrow workhouse bed, and this would prove to be nothing more than a desperate dream. But the Duke's gentle hand on her elbow as he helped her mount the horse felt solid and real, as did his warm cloak when he settled it around her shoulders. "Are you quite certain about this, Your Grace?" she whispered as they prepared to leave. "I'm nobody special, just an orphan with no family or fortune. Why would you?" He paused in adjusting the stirrups and looked up at her with those remarkable grey eyes. For a moment, something almost vulnerable flickered across his aristocratic features. "Everyone deserves a chance at a better life, Miss Hartwell," he said quietly, his words meant for her ears alone. "And perhaps we can help each other find what we've both been missing." Before she could ask what he meant, he swung up behind her on the great horse, and they rode away from the square that had nearly become the site of her bondage. As the village fell away behind them, Eliza caught glimpses of rolling green hills and ancient oak trees that seemed to whisper promises of adventure. The Duke rode in contemplative silence for several miles, but Eliza could feel the tension in his posture, as if he were wrestling with some internal debate. Finally, as they crested a hill that offered a view of a vast estate in the distance, he spoke. "Raven's Hollow Manor has been quiet for far too long," he said, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been hope. "Perhaps it's time for laughter to echo through those halls again." Eliza stared at the approaching manor, a magnificent structure of grey stone and soaring towers that looked like something from a fairy tale. Gardens spread out around it like a green carpet, though she could see even from this distance that they had been left somewhat wild, as if nature had been allowed to reclaim parts of them. "It's beautiful," she breathed, meaning every word. "It can be," he replied thoughtfully, "with the right spirit to bring it back to life." As they drew closer to what would be her new home, Eliza felt a mixture of excitement and terror coursing through her veins. What had this mysterious Duke seen in her? What did he expect from their arrangement? And most importantly, what secrets waited within the walls of Raven's Hollow Manor? One thing was certain. Her life would never be the same again. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and when we reach that milestone, we'll have an incredible surprise waiting for all our loyal viewers. Trust us, you won't want to miss what we have planned. The great oak doors of Raven's Hollow Manor opened to reveal an interior that took Eliza's breath away. Soaring ceilings disappeared into shadow above, while portraits of stern-faced ancestors gazed down from gilded frames. Despite the grandeur, there was something melancholy about the place, dust motes dancing in shafts of sunlight that struggled through heavy curtains, and a silence that seemed to press against the walls like a living thing. "Mrs. Hartwell will show you to your rooms," the Duke said, summoning an elderly woman who appeared as if from nowhere. The housekeeper was a kindly-looking soul, with silver hair pinned back severely and eyes that held warmth despite their sharp intelligence. Sarah, please see that Miss Eliza has everything she requires. Miss Eliza? The housekeeper repeated with surprise, glancing between the Duke and the young girl. Your Grace, surely you don't mean— I mean exactly what I say, the Duke replied firmly. Miss Hartwell is my ward now, not a servant. She is to be treated accordingly. As Mrs. Hartwell led her up a grand staircase carpeted in deep burgundy, Eliza caught glimpses of rooms that seemed frozen in time. In one, she spotted a pianoforte covered with a dust sheet. In another, bookshelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with more volumes than she had ever imagined could exist in one place. Here we are, miss, Mrs. Hartwell said, opening a door to reveal a bedroom that was larger than the entire dormitory Eliza had shared with 20 other girls at the workhouse. A four-poster bed dominated the space, hung with curtains of pale blue silk. Tall windows overlooked the manor's gardens, and a small sitting area was arranged around a fireplace that could have held a small tree. This is all for me, Eliza asked, hardly daring to believe it. His Grace's instructions were very clear, Mrs. Hartwell replied, though her tone suggested she found the situation as extraordinary as Eliza did. You're to have a lady's education, music, languages, literature, dancing. A governess will arrive from London within the week. After the housekeeper left her to settle in, Eliza stood at the window watching the sun set over grounds that seemed to stretch to the horizon. In the growing twilight, she could see the Duke walking alone through the gardens, his tall figure moving between overgrown rose bushes and untended pathways. There was something deeply lonely about his solitary figure, and she found herself wondering what tragedy had driven him to such isolation. Dinner was served in a dining room that could have seated 50 people, though only 2 places were set, one at the head of the great table for the Duke and another to his right for her. Crystal glasses caught the light from dozens of candles, and the food was finer than anything she had ever tasted. Yet throughout the meal, she noticed how the Duke's eyes would drift toward an empty chair across from him, as if expecting someone who would never come. Tell me about yourself. Miss Hartwell, he said suddenly, startling her from her observations. What are your interests? What do you dream of becoming? It was the first time in her life that anyone had asked her such questions. At the workhouse, children were expected to work and obey, not dream or aspire to anything beyond basic survival. I love to read, she said hesitantly, and I've always wondered what it would be like to travel, to see places beyond the village. Sometimes I imagine what it would be like to help people, to make their lives better somehow. Something flickered in the Duke's eyes at her words. Approval, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. Knowledge is the greatest treasure any person can possess, he said thoughtfully, and the desire to help others. That is the mark of true nobility, regardless of birth. Over the following days, Eliza began to understand the rhythm of life at Ravenshollow Manor. The Duke spent most of his time in his extensive library, working on what Mrs. Hartwell described as important scholarly pursuits. But in the evenings, he would emerge to dine with Eliza, and these conversations became the highlight of her days. He spoke to her not as a child to be patronized, but as an intelligent person whose opinions mattered. She learned that he was passionate about social reform, that much of his research involved finding ways to improve conditions for the poor and disadvantaged. His library contained not just classics and poetry, but detailed studies of workhouse conditions, factory safety measures, and proposals for educational reform. It began to make sense why he had reacted so strongly to seeing her on that auction block. You saved me, she said one evening as they walked through the manor's portrait gallery. But why? You could have any companion you wanted, someone of your own class, someone educated and refined. He paused before a portrait of a young woman with kind eyes and golden hair, and Eliza noticed his expression soften with what could only be described as profound sadness. I once knew someone who believed that a person's worth had nothing to do with their station in life, he said quietly. She taught me that the greatest privilege of wealth and position is the ability to lift others up. When I saw you standing on that platform with such dignity despite your circumstances, it reminded me of promises I had made to honor her memory through my actions. Eliza understood then that the Duke carried his own deep wounds, just as she carried hers. The difference was that his pain had driven him to help others, while hers had simply been something to endure. "She must have been very special," Eliza said softly. "She was," he replied, "and she would have wanted me to ensure that you have every opportunity to become the remarkable woman I believe you're meant to be." As weeks turned into months, Eliza flourished under the Duke's care and guidance. Her governess, Miss Pemberton, no relation to the baker's wife, was a brilliant woman who opened up worlds of literature, science, and philosophy. She learned to play the pianoforte, to speak French and Italian, and to carry herself with the confidence of someone who truly belonged in such grand surroundings. But more than that, she began to understand her role in the Duke's life. She wasn't just a charity case he had rescued on a whim. She was helping to heal something broken within him, bringing laughter and energy back to a house that had been shrouded in grief for too long. One evening, as they sat by the fire in the library while autumn rain drummed against the windows, the Duke made an announcement that would change everything once again. "I've been thinking, Miss Hartwell, about your future," he said, setting aside the book he'd been reading. "You've proven yourself to be exceptionally intelligent and capable. I believe it's time you learned about the broader work I've been doing, the projects that could benefit from your unique perspective and passionate heart." "What do you mean?" she asked, though her pulse quickened with excitement. "I mean, my dear girl, that I think you're ready to help me change the world, starting with ensuring that no other child ever has to stand on an auction block as you did," as he outlined his plans for revolutionary reforms to the workhouse system and his vision for schools that would educate children regardless of their birth circumstances. Eliza felt something she had never experienced before, a sense of true purpose. This mysterious Duke, who had rescued her from a fate she could hardly bear to contemplate, was now inviting her to stand beside him as they worked to prevent other children from suffering as she had. Looking into the fire, she saw not flames, but possibilities, a future where she could use her painful past to create something beautiful and meaningful. The orphan girl who had once stood trembling on a village auction block was gone forever, replaced by a young woman with the courage to dream of changing the world. Thank you so much for following Eliza's incredible journey with us. If you've enjoyed this story, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We're so close to reaching 1,000 subscribers, and when we do, we have an absolutely amazing surprise planned for our community, something that will take your breath away. Hit that subscribe button and join our growing family of story lovers. You won't want to miss what we have in store.